Good evening and welcome. I'm Mike Hearn. I'm the Douglas Dillon Chair of the Department of Asian Art here at the Met, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the second Rubin Museum Distinguished Lecture in Himalayan Art. So the Rubin Museum, in addition to sponsoring this evening's lecture, has long been one of the leading institutions for the study and dissemination of the arts and cultures of Tibet and the Himalayas. And most recently, of course, the Rubin no longer has a museum space in New York, but it remains a global institution in the exhibitions and programs that it sends abroad, the publications that it sponsors, and lectures and programs such as this. And of course, also the Himalayan Art Project, which is a website which is an extraordinary resource for the field. So these are all things that we're very grateful to the Rubin for sustaining and maintaining. The dynamic transformation of the Rubin has really been the work of Jorrit Brigsti. And Jorrit came to the museum in 2017 as its executive director. But before that, he was for nearly a decade at the Rietberg Museum in Zurich. And he was also publisher of the Artibus Asia magazine or journal, which is one of the great Asian art and archaeological journals in the field. So he has a deep experience in the field before coming to New York. He's also, of course, was educated in Switzerland. He earned his MA in art history and sinology from the Zurich University and went on to getting his PhD with highest honors in East Asian art history. He's also conducted excavations in Eastern China and in Bhutan. And in 2017, he was part of the Getty Leadership Institute, which was a perfect stepping off point for joining the Rubin. So may I introduce Jorrit and invite him to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, and thanks to the Metropolitan. And as mentioned, as part of our ongoing commitment and efforts in New York City, not only the Shrine Room that we recently opened at the Brooklyn Museum, but also the Rubin Museum Distinguished Lecture here offered in partnership with the Met, aims to bring more awareness and appreciation for the arts of Tibet and the Himalayan region. And by joining forces really with the Met, we hope to highlight the importance of the artistic and cultural legacy of a region that really connects the Indian subcontinent with parts of Inner Asia and China, yet is often overlooked. Last year, and complementing the extraordinary exhibition here at the Met, Mandalas, Mapping Buddhist Art of Tibet, we were honored to welcome Dr. Professor Rob Lynroth as our inaugural speaker. Today, it is our pleasure to welcome and to introduce the Kathmandu-born and Paris-based scholar Kunsang Namgyal-Lama. Dr. Namgyal-Lama is currently lecturer at the National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilisations and the Practical School of Advanced Studies, both in Paris. She's also associate researcher at the Center for South Asian and Himalayan Studies at the French Institute for Research on East Asia. Dr. Namgyal has studied at Sorbonne University and has received her PhD in 2013 with her thesis Les Tsatsa du monde tibétain, étude de la production de l'iconographie et des styles de moulage et estampes bouddhiques. She analyzed and traced different types of Buddhist molded clay images called tsatsa. She's lectured and authored widely on the topic, including, as Mike was mentioning, on our platform, Project Himalayan Art, there under the title, Mass Production of Images as a Ritual Practice. And as a postdoc, she has been researcher for various projects such as Tibetan Buddhist Monastery Collections Today, which is supported by Arts and Humanities Research Council and School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and CALM, Territories, Communities and Exchanges in the Sino-Tibetan Calm Borderlands, China, sponsored by the European Research Council. Dr. Namgyal-Lama has also served as a commissioner of an exhibition of photographs of the Kathmandu Valley and Dolpo, taken by the French anthropologist Corneille Yest at the Patan Museum, and has studied pictorial representations of the so-called 100,000 Chaitya ritual published last year. She seems to be really into things with many numbers. And forthcoming is a contribution by hers on Tibet in the Handbook of Comparative Epigraphy. Today, we will be hearing from her about a forgotten milestone in Tibetan art. The focus for tonight's lecture are the intriguing wall paintings to be found in the two-story temple that was part of the Gyantse Dzong in the Dzong region in central Tibet. This temple, despite having suffered extensive damage during the Cultural Revolution, features a unique and intriguing pictorial program that really speaks in different artistic languages. And it raises interesting questions around the artists involved, patronage, and the influence of local workshops. And it powerfully reminds us the important role artistic exchange played in a landlocked region we tend to think of as inaccessible. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Namgyal-Lama.
Thank you very much, Jorit, for this very nice introduction. Thank you very much for the audience to be here tonight. It's a pleasure for me to give you this talk. But first, let me please thank the teams of the Met Museum who made this event possible, and especially John Guy. I don't see him, John, and also Francesca and Camille for organizing this conference with such efficiency and kindness. I would also want to express my sincere and my very warmest thanks to the team, the wonderful team of Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art, particularly Jorit, Elena, and Carl. It is an honor for me to presenting my research as part of the Rubin Distinguished Lecture Series. I couldn't imagine a more prestigious and welcoming setting. So with this modest contribution, I especially want to pay tribute tonight and I want to express my profound gratitude for Professor David Jackson, who so sadly and far too early passed away 2 months ago, and whose contribution to the history of Tibetan painting is and will remain unsurpassed. I deeply regret his absence and would have greatly valued his comments on what I'm about to share. So this lecture is dedicated to his memory. Thank you. So my talk this evening will focus on mural paintings from the late 14th century, preserved in a little-known temple in Gyantse, in central Tibet. As we shall see, despite their poor state of preservation, they nevertheless reveal fascinating iconographic and stylistic features, highlighting both the textual cycles that were valued at the time and the collaboration of artistic workshops of different origins during a pivotal period in the history of Tibetan paintings. To briefly introduce the geographical and historical context, Gyantse is located in the Dzong region, southeast of Shigatse, in the fertile valley of the Nyang River, a tributary of the Tsangpo, the upper course of the Brahmaputra. In this valley, many religious foundations date back to the early Chidar period, that is the later diffusion of Buddhism on the Tibetan plateau between the 11th and 14th centuries. Among there are Sinesar, Nening, and most relevant to our topic, Shalu Monastery. The Shalu Monastery still preserves some of the oldest mural paintings created under the stylistic influences of Palla art from eastern India, the Newar art of the Kathmandu Valley, as well as of Yuan China. Let me also point out that during the 14th century, Tibet was under the authority of the Sakya religious hierarch, who maintained privileged relations with the Yuan-Mongol court in China. The site of Gyantse is best known for two major monuments preserved within the monastic compound of Pelkochede, nestled at the foot of a ring of surrounding hills. So the main temple, the Tsuklakang, and the great stupa known as the Kumbum, which we can see here. These two monuments, founded during the first half of the 15th century under the patronage of the local prince Rabten Kunsang Pak, were spared during the Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s. Today, they provide the most complete and best preserved pictorial and sculptural representation of the Tibetan Buddhist pantheons and are well known to historians of Tibetan art. In these two monuments, the murals were created primarily under Newar aesthetic influence, called as Pelri in Tibetan, which reached its heyday between the mid-14th and mid-15th centuries. Chinese stylistic elements from the Ming period are also evident. The murals I will be discussing today are not preserved in this monastic compound, but inside the temple of Samphel Rinpoche Ling within the Gyantse fortress, the Dzong, on top of the rocky hill just opposite the Pelkochede. Erected halfway up the hill, the temple of Samphel Rinpoche Ling comprises 2 stories, and as we can see here, the outside walls of the small upper chapel are painted orange-red. The various buildings on this rocky outcrop date back to different periods, the earliest having been founded as early as the mid-14th century by the rulers of Gyantse. Two Tibetan historical sources shed light on the history of the Princes of Gyantse and on the chronology of the monuments they erected. The first is the biography of Rabten Kunsang Pak. The second is a historical guide to the Nyang region. According to these two documents, it was Kungya Pakpa in red, written in red there, I hope you can see it, Kungya Pakpa, who founded the temple of Samphel Rinpoche Ling as a private temple in the Iron Horse year 1390. It was consecrated in the year of the rat, which could either be 1396, or 1408. The emergence of the House of Gyantse goes back to Palden Zangpo from the Sharka family. During the 14th century, Palden Zangpo became a key player in the administrations of the domains of Sakya in Tsang, and through the diplomatic relations he maintained with the rising Pagmo-Drupa power based in Neudong, so he also took the advantage of his position and of the support provided to him by the last Yuan Emperor Togon Temur to consolidate his estate in the region. He was thus able to take control of various strategic sites where he founded religious institutions and secular buildings, as in Sechen, which became their first seat of power. But a few years later, the rulers decided to settle a mere 5 kilometers further south. In 1365, Palden Zangpo led the foundations of the great fortress called the Peak of the Victory Castle, Gyalkartse, on top of the rocky hill here. So later, on 1390, his eldest son, Kungya Pakpa, built the temple known as Samphel Rinpoche Ling. It seems that this temple subsequently went through the centuries without no renovation work or major damage, largely overshadowed by its illustrious neighbors at Pelkochede, founded about 30 years later. However, in the early 20th century, the British military expedition caused significant damage. Indeed, in 1904, During the Young Husband expedition, a large part of the fortress was shelled, and several buildings were damaged or destroyed. In the photographs taken just after this episode, it appears that Samphel Rinpoche Ling temple did not suffer any damage, at least on its south and west sides. But unfortunately, no contemporary account mentions the state of the temple. In the 1930s, when the Tibetologist Giuseppe Tucci conducted fieldwork, he reported that much of the temple had been destroyed, with only a few carefully carved pillar capitals remaining, and the murals had completely disappeared. Looking at the photographs taken by the German mission in 1938-39, we can see that the outside of the building was still in the same condition as after the British expedition. By the late 1960s, the Cultural Revolution may have caused some damage, but I haven't found any detailed information about the state of the temple. In the rare photographs taken in the 1980s, we can see that the lower temple was not completely roofed and opened directly onto the upper chapel. And this was still the case in 1986. In the early 1990s, renovation work was carried out and two high pillars were raised at the center of the open lower level courtyard to support a skylight. So shown here is a 3D sketch of the lower level temple. The entrance faces east. It consists of a pillared hall which was turned into an assembly hall. At the back, a two-pillared inner sanctum or a cella is surrounded by a circumambulation corridor, which is now blocked by a stone wall in the northern section. The upper chapel is situated directly above the cella. Regarding the wall paintings, the original murals are only partly preserved inside the cella on its outer walls and along the southern wall of the assembly hall. Unfortunately, they no longer exist in the northern section, and in the eastern section near the entrance, only faded fragmentary paintings are to be found. So in the circumambulation corridors, they are barely visible. The surviving murals can still be identified based on the brief descriptions found in the two Tibetan historical sources mentioned earlier. However, these accounts merely enumerate the principal themes and do not specify their exact location on the walls or their precise iconography. As I hope to show you through several examples, the paintings on the lower level still display several classical themes of the time, rendered in remarkable details and in styles influenced by Newar art and by Chinese traditions from the late Yuan and the early Ming. The examination of certain mural sections also reveals an earlier Chinese style which raises many questions, particularly regarding the workshops of artists who worked at this site. To give you an idea, here are some photographs of the lower level temple, which has been fitted out as an assembly hall. We can see the two modern red pillars supporting the skylight roof, as well as older pillars with the carved capitals mentioned by Tucci. Inside the cella, the paintings on the back wall show the 35 confession Buddhas, while on the south wall, fragments depicting the goddess Parnashvari and her retinue remain partially visible. On the other two walls, the paintings from the foundation period have completely disappeared and have been replaced by modern representations. So according to the text, they once depicted Vaishravana, Jambala, and the transmission lineage of the Lamje, that is the religious masters related to the Sakya order. The statues of Buddha Shakyamuni and Amitabha, together with the stupas you see here, are modern additions from the 1990s. They replaced works originally dating back to the foundation period in the early 15th century. The Confession Buddhas on the south and west walls are each enclosed in a trilobate frame with a red background inspired by Newar styles, with throne backs decorated with distinctive triangular jewel motifs. This type of structure can also be observed in earlier Newar-style paintings at Shalu Monastery. What is interesting here is the dark background, almost black, highlighted by simple polylobed cloud motifs, which is rather unusual in Tibetan paintings. One may wonder whether this background was inspired by the illustrations of Chinese Buddhist text on indigo-colored paper from the early Ming period, as in this example from the National Museum in Taipei. National Palace Museum, in Taipei. Still within the cella, a short inscription next to the fragmentary image of the goddess Parneshvari provides significant information. It mentions not only two artists from Kharkha, which is located not far from Gyantse, as responsible for this mural section, but more importantly, it specifies their execution in a style described as Gyanak Pelpe looks, literally the Newar tradition of China, which can be understood as the Newar painting style of China. Although only partially visible, the image of Parneshvari recalls the one painted more than 30 years later in a chapel of the Kumbum within the Pelkor Chode complex. However, the rendering of the tree foliage above her is unique to this example. Now, if we look at the surviving murals in the assembly hall, they also correspond to the iconographic themes mentioned in the two textual sources. On the outer walls of the cella here, we recognize compositions depicting the medicine Buddha Bhaisajya Guru on one side and the Buddha Shakyamuni surrounded by arhats on the other. The wall section with the medicine Buddha is one of the best preserved in the assembly hall. The composition is centered on Bhaisajya Guru, together with his full retinue, comprising around 50 secondary deities. The medicine Buddha is shown with a golden complexion, holding a mirobolant plant with 3 fruits in his right hand and a bowl in his left. His face is finely painted with elongated earlobes and a high Ushnisha crowned with a jewel. 2 small rosettes adorn his head, one above each ear. These are all typical features of the Newar stylistic repertoire of the 14th and 15th centuries, and would later be widely used in the wall paintings of the Pelkor Chode temples in the first half of the 15th century. We also note that the painters rendered the rich floral ornamentation of the monastic robes with a slight relief effect using the technique of raised gilded pastiglia. Bhaisajya Guru is flanked by 16 bodhisattvas, including 2 main ones, the red-orange Surya Prabha and the yellow-white Chandra Prabha depicted right at his side. So here, in his right hand, Surya Prabha holds a lotus marked with a sun, while Chandra Prabha holds a lotus bearing a crescent moon in his left hand. They are painted in the Newar style, which is evident not only in the way the figures, faces, and high chinians, the Jattamukta, are rendered, but especially in their ornaments, consisting of characteristic crowns with elaborate golden jewels settings or fleurons, circular earrings, and also elaborate necklaces. The abundant use of the intense red color also links this wall painting to the narrow Pellery style paintings. However, it should be noted here that the circular halos are painted in a flat, opaque red and not enhanced with the more usual vegetal scrollworks patterns. At the top of the composition, some of the 7 Buddhas of medicine, considered as brothers of Bhesajya Guru, can be seen, along with 2 historical figures unrelated to his retinues. One appears to be a religious master wearing a pandita hat, and the other one looks like a ruler. Also part of the usual entourage are the 12 Yaksha generals, depicted here on either side of the central triad. So they are also painted in a Newar influence style. Finally, below the throne of Bhesajya Guru are the 10 gods of the direction, the Dashadikpala, identifiable by their different mounts, with the 4 great kings also here, but they are very difficult to see. The themes of Medicine Buddha, surrounded by his full mandala as described in the Bhesajya Guru Bendurya Prabharaja Sutra, became a very popular subject in Tibet from the 14th century onward. Numerous representations on tankas and some also on wall paintings here from the 14th and 15th centuries have been passed down to us, such as these examples. So here in Shalu Monastery. As for the mural now depicting the Buddha Shakyamuni surrounded by arhats, it is unfortunately less well preserved. Yet the figure of the Buddha can still be seen at the center of the composition, seated on a lotus placed upon a throne, but the arhats around him have largely faded, making them very hard to distinguish. This painting is nevertheless very interesting, and in particular, regarding the unusual treatment of the Buddha's layered robes, especially the depiction of the blue shawl with its subtle, refined border worn very loosely and draped over his right arm. These ample flowing garments falling in soft folds clearly reflects a Chinese aesthetic, combined here with the more traditional red and gold patchwork robes of a fully ardent monk. This Chinese aesthetics is also evident in the representation of the 18 arhats, though very damaged, portrayed in various attitudes and dressed in ample garments. Of these 3 depictions of arhats, the central one shown frontally, with much of the painting unfortunately now lost, is still very interesting, as it vividly recalls the iconography of an arhat painted on a unique and important 14th century tanka, now preserved at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Indeed, we can see striking similarities here between the 2 paintings. In the arhat himself, dressed in a loose red robe with large circular earrings, in the way he holds a kind of staff, perhaps a ruhi scepter, and in the position of his hands and his feet also poking out from under the robe. We also find parallels in the surrounding figures, especially the one kneeling at his feet to offer him a bowl filled with jewels. His head and neck are draped in a red and blue striped shawl, while he also wears a long blue coat in a similar fashion. The presence of the banana plant behind the arhat's left shoulder is another notable feature. The similarities are so strong that they raise the question of whether the 2 paintings were produced by the same workshop, or whether the tanka may have served as a direct model. Turning now to the murals on the south wall, though still partly obscured by soot, the sections that have been cleaned reveal a general layout made up of 3 panels, each depicting a seated Buddha, flanked by 2 attendants and surrounded by narrative scenes. Unfortunately, the entire upper part remains covered by a thick layer of black soot, and the head of the Buddhas are not visible. Based on the themes outlined in the textual sources, these murals can be identified as representation of the Buddha of the past, Dipankara, in the right panel, the Buddha Tongwa Denden, which literally means the sight of which is beneficial and brings merits. That is Shakyamuni in the central one, in the central panel, and the Buddha of the future, Maitreya, in the left panel. Thus, we have here the Buddhas of the 3 times. Each composition is very dense and separated by a vertical row of small Buddhas portrayed within medallions. So around Dipankara, we find stories of the Buddha's past lives from the Jataka tales. Around Tongwa Denden, episode from the life of the Buddha Shakyamuni called the 12 Deeds. And around Maitreya, the story of Norzang or Sudhana's pilgrimage taken from the Gandavyuha Sutra of the Avatamsaka corpus. In depiction of Sudhana's story and the Jatakas, the narratives are set within compartmentalized horizontal registers. By contrast, the episodes from the life of the Buddha Shakyamuni on the central panel are rendered in a more open and fluid compositions, forming a continuous visual narratives. These paintings are executed in a blend of Newar, as we will see, and Chinese styles. While the Newar influence can be recognized in the use of compartmentalized narrative registers and in the depiction of the 2 bodhisattvas flanking the Buddha Tongwa Denden in the central panel, as we will see, the narrative scenes themselves were rendered in various Chinese-influenced styles, recognizable by the use of characteristic architectural forms, distinctive garments, and sinuous polylobed clouds. So the Chinese influence is particularly evident in the depiction of Sudhana's journey, in the search of teaching of spiritual advisors, or called Kalyana Mitra, in his quest of enlightenment. Each compartment, accompanied by a 2-line text below it, represent a place where Sudhana meets one of these spiritual friends. Although the paintings are in poor condition, riddled with bullet holes, perhaps the result of the 1904 conflict, it is still possible to clearly discern several episodes. In each scene, Sudhana is portrayed in accordance with the Chinese aesthetics as a young boy with 3 tufts of hair on his head, barefooted and with his hand joined in an attitude of devotion. Similar iconography appears in Chinese paintings of the Xixia, of the Yuan, or of the Ming periods, as we can see here. Although the theme of Sudhana's pilgrimage was popular in the Tibetan world, as well as across the broader Buddhist world, mural paintings devoted to this subject are relatively rare. It can be found, for instance, in the Tabo monastery in Spiti, and was also painted in the now destroyed early 15th century Kumbum of Gyang near Lhatse in Dzong, known to us only through a few photographs taken by Tucci. So therefore, this extensive depiction of the story of Sudhana in the temple of Samphel Rinpoche Ling, executed in a distinctly Chinese visual style, holds particular significance for the history of Tibetan art. As for the Jatakas surrounding the Buddha Dipankara, they are depicted within 34 compartments, slightly larger in size than those representing the Gandavyuha Sutra. They correspond to the tales of Aryashura Jatakamala, as confirmed also by a fragmentary inscription. These narrative scenes are also set within Chinese-inspired settings, and several stories can be recognized, such as the Mahakapi Jataka, the Mahisha Jataka, or the Matsya Jataka, the story of the fish shown here. So now in the central panel, the Buddha Shakyamuni appears between the Bodhisattvas Maitreya and Avalokiteshvara, surrounded in the visible area by an assembly that includes monks, Bodhisattvas, Buddhas, and possibly Pratyeka Buddhas. Most probably Pratyeka Buddhas. The inclusion of these categories of figures around the Buddha Shakyamuni clearly indicates that this composition corresponds to the one described in the Manjushri Mula Kalpa Tantra. Indeed, the 4th chapter of the Manjushri Mula Kalpa refers to this particular composition by the term Tongwa Dunden, meaning the sight of which is beneficial and brings merits. The Buddha Shakyamuni is depicted with his right hand in the earth witness gesture, Bhumishparsha Mudra. To his left, Avalokiteshvara holds the stem of a lotus flower, while to his left, Maitreya holds the stem of a Nagakeshara flower, which supports a barely visible small water flask. Maitreya is also adorned with a small stupa on his head. The depiction of these two standing bodhisattvas, clad in dhoti and richly ornamented with jewelry and characteristic crowns, is consistent with the Newar influence or Pelri style of the 14th century, most probably here executed by Tibetan artists. A closer examination reveals that the painter skillfully combined both Newar and Chinese aesthetics, as illustrated here by the representation of several secondary figures. Thus, the man wearing a red robe and a black hat displays characteristic of the late Sino-Yuan style, while the yaksha and the naga on the right reflect an influence rooted in the Newar artistic tradition. Surrounding these central triad and assemblies are scenes from the life of the Buddha Shakyamuni, among which the parinirvana cycle is particularly noteworthy. Before we examine these scenes in detail, let me first give you a brief overview of how the episodes are arranged to provide a broader perspective. So the first visible episode appears on the right side, depicting Queen Maya Devi's return to the palace after the birth of the future Buddha, followed by scenes from Siddhartha's youth, illustrating his mastery of various worldly arts. The prince is then depicted living a princely life in the palace before the great departure in the lower part of the mural. The visual treatment of these episodes reflects a predominantly Chinese aesthetic, with scenes flowing seamlessly into one another, separated only by clouds, vegetation, or architectural motifs. The architectural setting is particularly remarkable here, featuring pavilion-style roof, open terraces, and sloping walls reminiscent of Tang period representations. For example, those found in Mogao Caves 148 or 321 at Tunhuang. I can't go into the detail of each depiction, but the scene showing the carriage here, the carriage bearing Queen Maya Devi, as she brings the infant Siddhartha back to the palace is of particular interest because it bears a striking resemblance to the same episode painted on a mural at Tashilhunpo Monastery. We indeed find almost the same form of carriage, with the long white ribbon hanging down on one side, a similar design of decorative elements on the triple-tiered roof, and even of the seat. One can also see the man turning the wheel of the carriage. The painting at Tashilhunpo is not clearly dated, and it has been suggested that it might be a 17th century work, possibly by the renowned painter Choin Gyantse. However, we know that a major 15th century painter, Menla Tundrup, produced murals depicting the life of the Buddha in a distinctly Chinese manner in the main temple of Tashilhunpo. Whoever the artist and whatever the date of this panel of Tashilhunpo, it raises the question of whether the painting at Samphel Rinpoche Ling may in fact have served as a source of inspiration. The narrative continues in the lower part, here, below the throne of the Buddha Shakyamuni. Then on the left side, here, where the scene of the enlightenment is represented with Mara's assaults, and above are the episodes of Parinirvana, of the Parinirvana. Just 1 second. So, at Samphel Rinpoche Ling, painters rendered these final major events in the Buddha's life in a rather elaborate way through various sequences. Here, various sequences, which seems exceptional within the Tibetan artistic context of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, both in murals or portable paintings. The lower section depicts the reclining Buddha surrounded by various members of the morning assembly, monks, including Ananda, gathered directly around the bed, and the gods carrying different banners. There is also a lay person in the appearance of a king holding the feet of the Buddha. The various versions of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra mention the presence of the Mallas, the inhabitants of Kushinagar, the area where this important event took place. We may wonder whether this is a Malla ruler or possibly another prominent lay figure. Then the Buddha's body, lying in a coffin here, is carried in a funerary procession to the cremation site, where it is placed on wooden cross pieces representing the funeral pyre, which is described in the various versions of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra as being made of fragrant sandalwood. The depiction also shows several figures standing nearby, playing musical instruments, such as a large drum, and carrying different offerings. A particularly interesting feature visible here is the depiction of the Buddha's feet in the form of footprint, like Buddhapadas, drawn on the coffin. This refers to the well-known episode involving Mahakashyapa, one of the Buddha's foremost disciples who requested to pay homage to the Buddha's body 7 days after he had entered nirvana. The Buddha is said to have miraculously extended both feet out of the coffin so that the disciple could venerate him. This representation of the Buddha's feet stretching out from within the coffin is exceptional in the Tibetan context. Nevertheless, it is attested in Tang, China, particularly in the Tunhuang paintings, such as those in Mogao Cave 148 and 332, as we can see here. This is also a motif that can be found in a few mural paintings from sanctuaries along the Silk Road in Central Asia. The shape of the coffin at Samphel Rinpoche Ling is also quite similar to those depicted in the Chinese example. It is very likely that this reflects a direct Chinese iconographic influence, either via imported portable paintings or through artists familiar with these models. Thus, the coffin is represented in this panel twice, before the cremation site at the top. The fire at the top is given the shape of a dome, which may be intended as a visual reference to a stupa. In the Tibetan context, these dynamic sequences moving from the reclining Buddha to the coffin processions, which is then placed upon a wooden funeral pyre, is seldom depicted. And the parinirvana scene is usually followed directly by the cremation and sometimes by the sharing or the veneration of the relics. Here, the artists appear to have followed an iconographic program inspired by the Chinese translation of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. The overall representation of the parinirvana is undeniably influenced by Chinese art and strongly recalls Tang Dynasty illustrations, not only in the selection of scenes and their arrangement along a winding path within an open compositional space, but also in the characteristic architectural structures and the assemblies of figures wearing Chinese-style garments. Other scenes related to the parinirvana were likely depicted above, including the sharing of the relics, but they are no longer visible due to the thick layer of soot. However, we can still identify one of the last scenes of this cycle at the top right here, illustrating the first council, which to my knowledge is also unique in mural paintings up to this time, but could be seen in later portable paintings, such as in this tanka. Okay, now regarding now the upper chapel here, the Chalier Kang, it is a small two-pillared shrine measuring approximately 8 by 5 meters. Unlike the lower floor, the Tibetan text mention only briefly the iconographic program of this chapel, merely stating that it contains large mandalas, the principal one being devoted to Kalachakra. Originally, this small shrine would have comprised several mandalas, perhaps 7 or 9, but only 4 remains today on the western wall and a fragmentary one on the northern wall, as we will see. Here, sorry. So the main image painted at the center of the west wall here, facing the entrance, is indeed dedicated to Kalachakra. It is flanked on its right by the mandala of Guya Samaja Akshobhya Vajra and on its left by that of Chakra Samvara. The northern wall to the right has preserved a lacunary mandala dedicated to Hevajra. Then the south wall shows some damaged modern depictions, while the east wall near the entrance no longer preserves any paintings. The central position of the Kalachakra mandala is certainly linked to the influence of Putan Rinchen Drup in the region, particularly over the house of Gyantse. As we know, this great scholar, Putan, was specially trained in this tantra and composed several commentaries on it. Moreover, Putan's first reincarnations, Kunga Lodro Gelsen, was none other than the brother of Kunga Pakpa, the founder of Samphel Rinpoche Ling. The absence of the Hevajra mandala on the main wall further confirms that the iconographic program did not follow the Sakya tradition. On the western wall, the 3 large mandala are surrounded by 16 small figures of tantric deities, painted in the interstices above and below the big mandalas, and arranged also in vertical rows on either side. All of the mandalas and deities in this chapel belong to various tantric cycles associated with the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, the highest class of tantric teachings in Tibetan Buddhism. The distribution of the mandalas and deities is also significant. Those placed to the right of the Kalachakra mandala are devoted to the Father Tantras, with the Guhya Samaja Akshobhya Vajra mandala as the principal one, and those to the left are associated with the mother or Yogini Tantras, among which the Chakra Sambhara one is the most important. We may presume that due to the limited size of the chapel, the other 16 tantric deities were not represented within their own mandalas, together with their retinues. The main mandalas here appear to correspond broadly to the iconographic descriptions given in the Nishpana Yoga Valley, a seminal tantric manual composed by Abhayakara Gupta in the 11th or early 12th century. So an examination of this painting reveals that, compared with the murals on the lower level, those of the Shelier Kang here are executed in such a distinctly narrow manner that they were most probably realized by Nepalese painters from the Kathmandu Valley. If we take a close look at the Guhya Samaja mandala depicted according to the Nagarjuna tradition, we see that the central pair and the 4 jinas in the cardinal direction are shown seated with a typical Newar style shrine. This consists of a throne, surmounted by a decorative arch formed by the unfurled tails of 2 makaras, one on each side, and topped by a Kirtimukha face grasping snakes. Another distinctive feature of Newar aesthetics is the abundant use of vegetal scroll works patterns, which fill the background with contrasting colors. This Nepalese style emerged even more clearly in the depictions here of wrathful deities such as Sanmukha Krishna Yamari or Mahachakra Vajrapani, shown in dynamic poses against a red halo of leaping flames. The treatment of the fiery halo with its tightly packed scrolling motifs, as well as the portrayal of the fierce deities with globular eyes highlighted with a red line and trilobed thick eyebrows, can be directly linked to the contemporary production from the Kathmandu Valley. Particularly remarkable is the rendering of the finely drawn bone ornaments, emphasized by the subtle shading of the deities' dark blue-black complexions. This distinctly Newar style is also evident in the image of here the Kala Chakra embracing his Prajna Vishwamata, especially in the treatment of the goddess' face and the exquisite filigree-like set of bone ornaments that adorns her. This image of Yogambhara and Janadakini is again executed in a purely Newar manner, characterized by deep tonalities, predominantly red, contrasted with blue. Here is also a detail of one of the 8 charnel grounds associated with the tantric tradition of the Chakra Sambhara mandala, revealing the remarkable finesse of the drawing. So with some of the Mahasiddha also inside this channel grounds. So the main part of this Chakra Samvara mandala here show also the deity in his most common form at the center of several concentric cycles together with his consort, the goddess Vajravarahi. Although there is no epigraphical or textual evidence identifying the artist who worked in this small mandala shrine, the stylistic treatment of the murals strongly suggests that they were Newar painters from the Kathmandu Valley. Unlike the murals in the lower temple, which were executed by Tibetan artists from Kharkar and also other regions of the central Tibet, trained in both Nepalese and Chinese aesthetics, the Newar style employed here is not what I call a Tibetanite form of Newar aesthetics known as Pelri. That is a Newar style assimilated and adapted to Tibetan tastes, but rather a pure Newar style of the type generally produced in Nepal for Newar patrons. Moreover, these murals display no elements of Chinese or Yuan influence, such as the stylized cloud motifs around the figures on mandalas, which are often combined with the Pelri style in southern Tibet at the time. Another noteworthy feature pointing to a Newar execution of these wall paintings is the absence of lineage figures above or between the mandalas, a subject that is generally considered to be an important part of the iconographic programs in the Tibetan context, so the lineage figures. So a quick comparison now between the paintings of Samphel Rinpoche Ling and contemporary Newar artworks shows a clear stylistic proximity. So here the goddess Vajravarahi is depicted in the Newar tradition, with her left legs outstretched and her right legs wrapped around her consorts. The type of jewelry and also attributes such as the skull cup, the kapala, and the damaru, the double-headed drum, are rendered in a distinctly Newar manners in these paintings. This Newar treatment is also found as here in this tanka from the Met, but with the addition of lineage masters here, a feature that reflects a form of Tibetanization of the Pelri style. So here, if I go back, you don't have on the upper part, no figures of the lineage masters, and then here you have the figures of the masters in the top register. Similar artistic conventions can be also observed in the treatment of the deity's facial features, particularly in the depiction of wrathful figures such as Sanmukha Krishna Yamari and a form of Bhairava shown with bulging eyes, frowning eyebrows, and a finely ornamented mustache and beard. A comparison of another example to show you here. A comparison of the Vajrabhairava figure here with a drawing of the same deity preserved in a sketchbook belonging to a Newar artist further reveals shared stylistic features. By contrast, the same deity, Vajrabhairava, depicted here on the right, in the Newar-derived Pelri style, reflects a more distinctly Tibetan taste, particularly in the treatment of the stacked faces here in the Lakma paintings. Here also the same stylistic tendencies can also be observed, for example, in this depiction of Mahachakra Vajrapani on the right, painted in the Samphel Rinpoche Ling on the left, and then in the right, painted in the Kumbum of Pelkorchode some 30 years later, which is much Tibetanized in the aspect, in the drawing. So through this presentation, I wanted to highlight the significance of the murals of Samphel Rinpoche Ling, which have so far received no scholarly attention. So despite the difficulty of observing them in situ, their examination through photographs reveals the unexpected richness of their iconographic programs and the remarkable diversity of their stylistic variations. So chronologically, these paintings at Samphel Rinpoche Ling stand between those of Shalu Monastery and those of the monuments of the Pelkhor Chode. Shalu Monastery is like early 14th century, and those are the monastery at Pelkhor Chode, beginning of or mid of 15th century. While many of the classical themes of the period are well represented, like the Buddha surrounded by arhats, the medicine Buddha, the 35 Buddha of Confessions, among others, the way these themes are treated stylistically shows some very distinctive features specific to this small temple. Indeed, the painters employed and at certain point skillfully blended Newar and Chinese stylistic influences, foreshadowing the kind of integration that will be later seen at the Pelkhor Chode. A close examination of the paintings in the lower temple shows that at least, for me, 3 or 4 distinct workshops were working in parallels. Some sections were executed in the Newar style that could be described as Tibetanized, such as the panels depicting Paisajya Guru and also the Tongwa Denden panels. Others, by contrast, display a much stronger Chinese influence, particularly the panels showing the arhats, the story of Sudhana, and also the Parinirvana, where, as we saw, one can easily discern features, characteristics of various periods of Chinese art. So this raises questions about the sources of inspiration and the training backgrounds of the painters, apparently Tibetans, in the lower temple. One may wonder whether some of them might have been trained by Nepalese or by Tibetan artists who had worked at the Yuan court and later returned to Tibet following the dynasty's collapse. By contrast, the murals in the upper chapel in the Shelyekang of the fortress are executed in a resolutely pure Newar style, a type that is not attested elsewhere in Tibet or even in the Kathmandu Valley, as no wall paintings from this period have survived. They may thus constitute the earliest known example of Newar murals. So the interesting things about the Shelyekang murals is that these is that these Newar artists did not at all adapt their work to the Tibetan taste as they used to do, and as, for example, the famous sketchbook of Jiva Rama, dated 1435, clearly demonstrates, but they have kept a style that is definitively Newar. So the mandalas of the fortress also likely influenced those of the nearby main temple of the Pelkhor Chode, completed in 1425. Since the same tantric cycle are found there, though arranged in a much more elaborate and complex layout with 15 large mandalas, including the central one here of Kalachakra, and 40 smaller ones, among which almost all the tantric deities depicted in the fortress shrine are depicted here. This observation led me to consider that among the 3 or 5 missing mandalas of the Samphel Rinpoche Ling Shelyekang, one was probably dedicated to Rakta Yamari on the Father Tantra side, probably resembling to these examples from the main temple of the Pelkhor Chode here. So the murals of the Samphel Rinpoche Ling thus constitute an important milestone for me in tracing the developments of the Tibetan paintings at the turn of the 15th century. This milestone is all the more significant given that many other contemporary temples or kumbums, great stupas, such as Tsechen for the monastery, Nenings, or Gyang as a kumbum, Jonang kumbum, or Narthang, have been either renovated or completely destroyed today. So thank you very much. I hope it was clear, but thank you.
Thank you all very much for being with us. I'm afraid we don't have time to take
Oh,
questions.
sorry.
Is that right, Fran?
That's correct, yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So thank you,
I
Norman. It
took
was a
them.
wonderful presentation with great images and the outlines to make it clear really brought us to a whole new level of understanding. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Sorry, thank you. Sorry, I took a bit.